All right, let's dive into another deep dive. This time, we're looking into the disappearance and murder of Caroline Koughby.
A case, really, full of twists and turns.
Definitely. We're going to be basing this deep dive on a Crime Junkie podcast episode about it.
Yeah, it's got everything you could want in a true crime case. A husband who looks suspicious at first.
Yeah.
A convicted murderer who's out on parole.
Conflicting witness statements, a huge manhunt that went nationwide.
And even, they use this cutting-edge DNA technology. It's a real nail-biter.
For sure. And, something I find really interesting about this case is how it, shows how messed up parole systems can be.
Oh, yeah, definitely. We're going to dig into that more as we go along.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's go back in time. November 1995 in Vancouver, Washington. Everything seems pretty normal at first.
Right.
Caroline and her husband, Daniel, they have a little argument.
Happens to every couple.
Exactly. So Daniel decides to spend the night with his brother. He even leaves a message on their answering machine, tells Caroline that he's staying over.
Seems innocent enough.
Right. But here's where it gets weird. The next morning, Daniel comes home, and Caroline is gone. And their 2 daughters are gone, too.
Whoa. Okay, so red flag right there.
Yeah, and the podcast doesn't really get into how the police first reacted, but we know that Daniel didn't just sit around. He and his brother, they immediately start looking for Caroline.
Makes sense.
They drove all over Vancouver, checking all the places she usually went to.
So, like, her favorite spots, places they hung out.
Exactly. And guess what? Their search leads them to this nightclub called Omar's, and they find Caroline's car in the parking lot.
Okay, so that shifts the focus a bit.
Big time. Witnesses at the club tell the police that Caroline was there on Saturday night. She was really upset and drinking a lot.
And that raised some concern because, if I remember correctly, her family said that Caroline had been struggling with substance abuse after she was in a car accident a while back.
Right. And to make matters worse, the staff at Omar's and people who were there that night, they remember seeing Caroline with this guy named Dennis Smith.
Dennis Smith. All right. Got to keep that name in mind.
Yeah. They said Caroline was so drunk she could barely walk. They saw Dennis helping her out of the club. Even the bouncer saw them outside. He gave Caroline her purse back because she'd forgotten it.
Oh, wow. So she was really out of it.
Yeah, the bouncer even mentioned how drunk she was.
So, naturally, Dennis becomes a person of interest, right?
Of course. So the police bring him in for questioning. At first, Dennis downplays his interaction with Caroline, says he was just being a good guy, helping her to her car because she was wasted.
Sure. Okay.
But then his story gets kind of strange. He adds in this mysterious attacker who supposedly hit him with a stick and then kidnapped Caroline.
Wait, hold up. A random attacker.
Yeah.
That seems a little fishy, doesn't it?
Totally. The investigators weren't buying it either, especially because Dennis never reported this attack to the police. And then there's the fact that Caroline's car was just sitting there untouched in the parking lot.
That doesn't line up with this story at all.
Nope. And here's another strange thing. The police actually had 2 separate reports from the night of November 11th. People called in saying they heard a woman screaming for help. It was coming from a field near Omar's.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah. Police went to check it out, but they couldn't find anything. But given the location and the timing, it makes you wonder.
If those screens were Caroline's, chilling.
It adds another layer of mystery to the whole thing,
Absolutely. So, what happens next?
So the police, they keep digging, interviewing people in the area around Omar's, and they get this really important tip. A clerk at a convenience store remembers seeing a guy with blood on his shirt and a bandage on his hand. He was all bloody and bandaged up in the early morning hours of November 12th.
And that guy was?
Dennis Smith.
I knew it. So much for the good guy act.
Right. It totally contradicts his original story, where he didn't mention anything about being injured or going to that store.
Yeah, it's pretty clear he's hiding something.
It's obvious he's not being truthful. And remember how Daniel got that tip from someone who recognized Dennis from news reports? Well, it turns out Dennis had this huge secret. He was a convicted murderer.
No way.
Yeah. Back in 1982, Dennis killed his own sister to stop her from telling the authorities about him breaking parole. He got a life sentence, but somehow they let him out on parole twice.
Wait, so he was out on parole after murdering his sister? That doesn't seem right.
I know, right? The first time was in 1993, and then they let him out again in 95, just a few months before Caroline vanished.
That's just unbelievable. And his parole officer, what did they say about all this?
Get this. Dennis's parole officer actually warned the parole board about him, said he was dangerous and they should keep him locked up.
They had a warning.
Mm-hmm.
And they still let him out.
Yeah, for some reason the parole board ignored the warnings.
It's just tragic. It really shows how these parole systems can fail and how that can lead to terrible consequences.
Yeah, it's really disturbing. So, armed with this new information about Dennis's past, the police brought him back in for more questioning.
I bet he changed his tune.
He did. This time, he claimed he gave Caroline a ride home from the nightclub. He even said they had sex in his truck, but that it was consensual.
Okay.
But he still stuck to the story about this mysterious attacker kidnapping her. Except now, he said the attacker was Daniel, Caroline's husband.
Trying to shift the blame, huh?
Yeah.
Classic move.
Yeah, but the police had already checked out Daniel's alibi, so they didn't believe it for a second. Plus, they noticed more holes in Dennis's story, and then they inspected his truck, and their suspicions got even stronger.
What did they find?
Well, right away, they saw this huge burn mark on the bench seat of Dennis's truck. It was like the size of a basketball.
Whoa, that's not subtle.
No kidding. Dennis tried to say it was just a cigarette burn, but the police weren't buying it, so they scheduled another inspection.
I bet Dennis was thrilled about that.
He wasn't. He didn't show up.
Oh, so he's running now.
Basically. He was definitely trying to hide something. When the police finally found the truck, all the carpet and upholstery were ripped out.
He wasn't even trying to be sneaky about it, was he?
Not at all. Dennis said he took it out because the smell of the burn was bothering him. But yeah, it was a pretty obvious attempt to cover up evidence.
So did they find anything in the truck after all that?
They did. Forensic testing found traces of blood that matched Caroline's DNA. It was on the steering wheel, the doors, and the dashboard.
Oh, wow, that's pretty damning.
Yeah, and arson experts also confirmed that the burn wasn't an accident. Someone used accelerant to start it.
So even without a body, they had enough to charge Dennis with murder.
Exactly. But there was one problem. Dennis had disappeared. He was on the run.
Oh, man.
Yeah, so the police launched a nationwide manhunt. They were looking everywhere for him. The FBI even issued a federal warrant for his arrest. But for months, they couldn't find him. It was agonizing for the investigators and, of course, for Caroline's family. But then, something incredible happened.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What happened?
The case was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries.
Wait.
And guess who was watching?
Dennis.
Dennis himself.
Oh, no. Did he try to reach out?
Actually, it led to a whole chain of events that ended up with him being caught. But it involved a dramatic standoff and a shooting in Florida. We'll have to get into all of that in the next part of our deep dive.
I can't wait. It's kind of wild how, just watching TV can lead to catching a fugitive, right?
Talk about a mistake. Seeing himself on Unsolved Mysteries totally freaked Dennis out.
Yeah, what did he do?
So he was using this fake name, David Sanborn, and he was staying with this couple. After the episode aired, he panicked, told them he was only wanted for, not paying child support. Then he stole their car and tried to run.
Oh, so they must realize something was up.
Yeah, thank goodness. The couple called the police right away, which, set off the whole chain of events that led to him getting caught.
I bet he regretted that decision real quick.
Oh, absolutely. So police in New Smyrna, Florida, they pulled Dennis over during a traffic stop.
Makes sense.
But he resisted arrest and even tried to grab the officer's gun.
Wow.
Things escalated, and the police ended up shooting Dennis.
Oh, wow. So did they know who they had?
No, they have no idea. It wasn't until they took him to the hospital and ran his fingerprints that they realized they had Dennis Smith, the guy wanted in connection with Caroline Koughby's disappearance.
Talk about a plot twist.
I know, right? The Florida police must have been shocked.
Makes you wonder if he thought he could just disappear in Florida.
I guess so, and it backfired big time.
Yeah, the Unsolved Mysteries episode forced him to make a move, and that was his downfall.
You reap what you sow. So once Dennis was in the hospital, Detective Joel LeBeau, the lead investigator on Caroline's case, he flew down to Florida to interview him.
Hoping to get some answers finally.
Exactly. They really wanted to find out where Caroline's remains were. But even though he was caught and facing serious charges, Dennis still said he was innocent.
Wow, he's sticking to his story.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? All that evidence against him, and he's still denying everything. But back in Washington, Caroline's family did get a little bit of closure, at least legally.
How so?
A judge, after seeing all the evidence against Dennis, decided to issue a death certificate for Caroline.
That must have been bittersweet for her family.
Definitely. It was a sad but necessary step, you know? It acknowledged her death and helped her loved ones start to grieve.
Right. So then what? Dennis gets extradited back to Washington.
Exactly. And he still pleaded not guilty to the charges.
Yeah.
First-degree murder, the whole 9 yards.
So what was his defense strategy? Was he still trying to pin it on Daniel?
Well, mostly his defense was that there was no body, and they said there wasn't enough evidence to actually connect him to the crime.
Not the strongest argument.
Yeah, and they did try to shift the blame back onto Daniel, but they didn't really have any evidence to back that up.
When in doubt, point the finger at the husband.
Right. But the prosecution had a lot of strong evidence, not just the forensic evidence from the truck and what Dennis's former cellmate said, but they were also going to bring in this brand new type of evidence, mitochondrial DNA analysis.
Oh, wow, this is where it gets really interesting.
I know, this was 1998, and mitochondrial DNA analysis was cutting-edge stuff.
So it wasn't used very often back then.
Nope, this was only the 6th time it had been used in a trial in the U.S.
Interesting. So why was this type of DNA analysis such a big deal?
Well, the cool thing is that you can get it from really small samples, like the blood they found on Dennis's watch and in his truck. And unlike regular DNA, which comes from both your parents, mitochondrial DNA only comes from your mother.
So they could directly link it to Caroline's family.
Exactly. They analyzed the blood found on Dennis's watch and compared it to the mitochondrial DNA from Caroline's mom. It was a perfect match.
So that pretty much shut down any claims Dennis could make about the blood not being Caroline's.
Pretty much. But of course the defense tried to fight it. They said mitochondrial DNA analysis was too new and unreliable.
Oh, come on.
I know, but the judge allowed it, which really hurt Dennis's case.
So even with that evidence, Dennis and his lawyers didn't give up.
Nope, they kept trying to make Daniel look suspicious. They talked about the fight they had and rumors that Caroline wanted a divorce.
I ain't dirty.
It totally backfired. The judge let the prosecution tell the jury about Dennis's previous murder conviction.
Oh, so they revealed he was a convicted murderer.
Yep, which definitely didn't help his case. And then things got really creepy. The prosecution brought in Dennis's former cellmate to testify.
Oh, this doesn't sound good.
It wasn't. The cellmate told the court about a conversation he'd had with Dennis in prison. Dennis had actually described how he would hide a murder if he ever committed another one.
Like a how-to guide for getting away with murder.
Exactly. He said he'd bury the body and then plant a tree over it and use fire to get rid of any evidence.
That's chilling, especially considering the circumstances of Caroline's case.
Right. And it showed that he had actually thought about killing someone and getting away with it. So the prosecution used this testimony to show the jury that Dennis was capable of violence and that he had planned this whole thing out.
So what did the defense do at that point?
Well, they tried to say that the cellmate was lying, maybe to get a shorter sentence for himself or something, and they brought up this thing about how search and rescue dogs had supposedly picked up Caroline's scent at her house and in Daniel's truck.
They were really grasping at straws at that point.
I think so.
Yeah.
But the prosecution shut those arguments down pretty quickly. They pointed out that Daniel had taken a lie detector test and passed, and the bartender backed up his alibi. Plus, there was zero evidence that Daniel had tried to bribe his brother or anything like that, and they reminded everyone that Dennis had said at first that he couldn't describe his attacker. He only named Daniel after he saw his face on the news.
So it sounds like they were just trying to distract from the fact that they didn't have a good defense for Dennis.
Exactly. And in the end, all the evidence against Dennis, especially the DNA and the cellmate's story, was just too much.
So what was the verdict?
Guilty. On May 12, 1998, the jury found Dennis Smith guilty of aggravated first-degree murder. They also found him guilty of kidnapping, rape, and trying to cover up a crime. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Wow. Justice was served.
Yeah, but it's still heartbreaking that they never found Caroline's body. And the fact that Dennis was out on parole even though he had already killed someone, it just makes the whole story even more tragic.
It's a really disturbing example of how the parole system can fail and how those failures can have devastating consequences.
We'll be back with the third and final part of this deep dive.
So even with Dennis behind bars, this case isn't really over, is it? Caroline's family still had to deal with the fact she was gone and they didn't even know where she was.
It's true. They never got to have a proper funeral or anything, and the fact that Dennis was already a murderer and they let him out on parole, it's just awful.
Yeah, it really makes you question the whole system, doesn't it?
Definitely. Caroline's family decided to sue the state of Washington in 1999.
They sued the state. Wow.
Yeah, they said the state was negligent in how they supervised Dennis while he was on parole.
That makes sense. They had all these warnings about him.
Exactly. Their lawyer basically showed how Dennis was just left to his own devices for months before Caroline disappeared. And get this, they found reports that he'd broken his parole, like, multiple times, failed drug tests and stuff.
And they didn't do anything.
Apparently not. The parole board just ignored it.
That's crazy. So the family's lawsuit, it wasn't just about getting money, right?
No, it was about holding the system accountable, showing that they messed up and let a dangerous guy hurt someone else.
It could have changed things,
Yeah.
made parole stricter, made them actually watch these guys.
It's a shame they didn't listen to those warnings.
So what happened with Dennis after he went to prison? Did he ever admit to anything?
Well, there was this weird thing a few years later. He tried to make a deal with the authorities.
A deal? Like what?
He said he'd tell them where Caroline's body was,
Oh, wow.
but he wanted $10,000 and a bunch of Taco Bell burritos in exchange.
Seriously. Taco Bell.
I know, right? It's bizarre. I don't know if he was serious or just messing with everyone.
It was hard to say with someone like him.
The authorities didn't take the deal anyway.
Good.
Then, in 2004, Dennis took detectives to this place on Larch Mountain. It's like an hour outside of Vancouver.
He said that's where her body was.
Yeah, but they searched and searched and they never found anything.
Another dead end. It's so sad for her family.
I know. And then just a few months later, Dennis killed himself in prison.
Wow. So we'll never know what really happened to Caroline.
It's a mystery that'll probably never be solved. This whole case, it really highlights how broken the justice system can be.
And how important it is to make sure those systems are actually working, to protect people.
Absolutely. I think this case leaves us with a lot to think about.
Definitely. It's a reminder that these stories, they're not just entertainment. They have real-world consequences.
And that we all have a part to play in making sure something like this doesn't happen again. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a heavy one, but an important one.
Absolutely.